The massive council chamber on Concordia Prime had seen many wars end, but never one like this. Admiral Sarah Chen walked through the curved corridors of the neutral station, her boots clicking against the metal floors. Around her, the walls hummed with the quiet energy of a dozen different life support systems, each one keeping a different species alive in the shared space. She paused at a viewport and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, her fleet waited in formation with weapons powered down but ready. The ceasefire had held for 3 days now, but nobody trusted it to last. Wars didn't end with handshakes anymore. They ended when one side couldn't fight back. The door to the council chamber hissed open and Sarah stepped inside. The room was enormous with curved walls that rose up into darkness. Each species had their own section, designed for their specific needs. The aquatic thetans floated in their water-filled tubes. The Silicon Collective representatives stood on heated platforms that kept their crystal bodies warm. And at the far end, taking up nearly a quarter of the chamber, were the Zephyrians. They were impressive, even sitting down. Each one stood nearly 8 feet tall, with thick scales that ranged from deep green to golden brown. Their eyes were large and unblinking, and when they moved, it was with the careful precision of natural predators. War Prime Thaxtel sat in the center of their delegation, his ceremonial armor catching the light from the chamber's many suns. Sarah took her seat in the human section. Her own delegation was small compared to the others. Humans had only been part of galactic politics for 50 years, and many of the older species still saw them as newcomers who didn't understand how things worked. The Mediator, a tall being from the Centauri Republic, called the session to order. Its voice carried through the chamber's translation systems, turning alien words into something each species could understand. We gather again to discuss the end of hostilities between the human colonial fleet and the Zephyrian collective, it announced. 18 months of warfare have cost both sides dearly. The time has come to find peace. War Prime Thaxtel stood, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured like distant thunder. The humans fight without honor, he said, his words translated into a dozen languages at once. They use tactics that no civilized species would consider. They sacrifice themselves for strangers. They attack with emotion instead of logic. How can we make peace with beings who cannot understand the proper way to conduct war? Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her face calm. She had heard this speech before in different words. The Zephyrians couldn't understand why human soldiers would risk their lives to save wounded enemies, or why human commanders would sometimes retreat to avoid civilian casualties. To them, it looked like weakness or madness. She stood to respond, knowing that every word would be analyzed by 7 different species, each looking for signs of deception or weakness. The Zephyrians speak of honor, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. But what honor is there in their systematic destruction of civilian targets? What logic is there in their refusal to take prisoners? They call us emotional, but they fight with a coldness that turns war into slaughter. The Zephyrian delegation shifted in their seats, scales rustling like dry leaves. War Prime Thaxtel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. That was something at least. In human conflicts, things would have escalated by now. Both species have different approaches to conflict, the Mediator said diplomatically. Perhaps we can find common ground in... An alarm sounded through the chamber, cutting off the Mediator's words. The lights dimmed automatically, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the room. Sarah recognized the uniform of the station's communications officer. Council members, we are receiving automated distress signals from the Kepler sector, the officer announced. A generation ship is broadcasting emergency codes. Life support appears to be failing. The chamber fell silent. The Kepler sector was the contested zone where most of the fighting had taken place. Any ship found there could belong to either side, or to one of the neutral species caught in the crossfire. War Prime Thaxtel spoke first. What ship? What registry? The vessel identifies as Kithara's Blessing, Zephyrian Registry, the communications officer replied. Long-range scans indicate significant life signs aboard. The ship appears to have been drifting for approximately 1 standard year. Sarah saw the change in the Zephyrian delegation immediately. Their careful composure cracked just slightly. Kithara's Blessing wasn't a military vessel. It was a civilian evacuation ship, one of dozens that had fled the outer colonies when the war began. War Prime Thaxtel's voice remained steady, but Sarah caught the subtle shift in his posture.
How many aboard?
Initial scans suggest 847 life signs, came the reply. However, the readings are inconsistent with adult Zephyrian physiology. Many appear to be significantly smaller. The translation took a moment to process, but when it did, Sarah understood immediately. Cubs. The ship was carrying Zephyrian young. The chamber erupted in quiet conversations as each delegation discussed the implications among themselves. Sarah turned to her Chief of Staff, Commander Harrison, who was already pulling up tactical displays on his tablet. "Where's our nearest fleet element?" she asked quietly. "Battle Group 7 is 2 days out from the signal location," Harrison replied. "We also have the hospital ship Mercury in the area, conducting rescue operations from the Tau Cygni engagement." Sarah looked across the chamber at the Zephyrian delegation. They were speaking in low, urgent tones, their usually perfect composure showing cracks. She didn't need a translator to understand their problem. Honor demanded they rescue their own people, especially their young. But their fleet was positioned on the far side of the contested zone, at least a week away from the distress signal. The mediator called for order, and the chamber gradually quieted. "The situation is clear," it announced. "We have a humanitarian crisis in progress. However, the vessel is located in contested space, and any rescue operation could be seen as a violation of the ceasefire." War Prime Thaxtel stood again, and this time Sarah could see the conflict in his posture. His duty to his people warred with his pride, and with the practical reality that his ships were too far away to help. "The collective requests," he began, then stopped. The words seemed to stick in his throat. Asking enemies for help wasn't something Zephyrians did easily. Sarah made the decision before he could finish the sentence. "The human colonial fleet will provide immediate assistance," she announced, standing up. "Battle Group 7 is already moving to intercept. Hospital ship Mercury will provide medical support. We estimate arrival in 36 hours. The chamber fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was the silence of surprise, of calculations being rapidly revised, of assumptions being challenged. War Prime Thaxtel stared at her for a long moment. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah met his gaze directly. "Because children don't wear uniforms," she replied. "And because the ceasefire means something to us, even if we disagree on everything else." She turned to leave, ignoring the urgent whispers that followed her toward the door. Her own staff scrambled to keep up as she headed back toward the human section of the station. Behind her, the council chamber remained in stunned silence, as 7 different species tried to understand what they had just witnessed. The humans, it seemed, were even more unpredictable than anyone had thought. The human section of Concordia Prime buzzed with activity. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the communications center, watching data streams from Battle Group 7 as they approached the drifting generation ship. The numbers on the screen told a story she didn't want to read. "Kythera's blessing has been without main power for 11 months, reported Lieutenant Commander Torres, the fleet's intelligence officer. "They've been running on emergency systems, but those are failing too. Life support is down to 30% capacity." Sarah studied the tactical display. The generation ship was massive, nearly 2 kilometers long, designed to carry thousands of Zephyrians to new colony worlds. Now it drifted helplessly in the dark space between stars, its hull scarred by debris impacts and system failures. "What about the life signs?" she asked. Torres pulled up a more detailed scan. 847 confirmed. "But Admiral, the biosignatures, most of them are small. Really small. We're talking about cubs that range from hatchlings to maybe adolescent age." The door hissed open, and Commander Harrison entered with a tablet in his hands. His expression was grim. "Admiral, I'm getting pushback from Fleet Command," he said quietly. "Admiral Rodriguez wants to know why we're risking ships and personnel for enemy civilians. He's concerned about the political implications." Sarah turned away from the displays. Through the viewport, she could see ships from other fleets maintaining their positions around the neutral station. Everyone was watching to see what the humans would do next. "Political implications," she repeated. "What about the moral implications, Commander?" Before Harrison could answer, an alarm sounded through the communications center. The main display shifted to show an incoming transmission from Battle Group 7. Captain Martinez appeared on screen, his face tight with concern. Admiral, we've made contact with Cathara's blessing, he reported. The situation is worse than we thought. We've got massive system failures throughout the ship. Their water recycling system failed weeks ago. Food supplies are nearly gone, and Admiral, he paused, running a hand through his hair. Most of the adult Zephyrians didn't make it. What we're looking at is mostly orphans. The communications center fell silent. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Orphaned cubs alone in a dying ship, waiting for rescue that might never come. Captain, begin emergency evacuation procedures, she ordered. Transfer all civilians to our medical ships immediately. Admiral, we have a problem, Captain Martinez replied. The cubs are terrified. They've never seen humans before, and to them we look like monsters. They're hiding in the ship's lower sections, and our people can't get close enough to help them. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, thinking. Fear was universal, she knew that much. But so was the need for care and safety. Captain, I'm sending you Dr. Rodriguez and his pediatric team. Also send a message to War Prime Thaxtel. Tell him we need Zephyrian volunteers to help with the evacuation. People the cubs will trust. Harrison looked up from his tablet. Admiral, the Zephyrians haven't responded to our evacuation offer yet. War Prime Thaxtel is still in council sessions. Sarah turned back to the main display. On screen, she could see the first shuttles approaching the generation ship. The massive vessel looked like a wounded animal, its lights flickering weakly against the starfield. Then we go without them, she said. But we're not leaving those cubs to die while politicians argue about pride. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sarah watched the rescue operation unfold on multiple screens, each one showing a different part of the desperate effort to save the Zephyrian survivors. Dr. Rodriguez and his team had managed to adapt their medical equipment for Zephyrian physiology, working from databases shared during the early days of first contact. The process was slow and careful, but it worked. Slowly, the first cubs began to appear on the human medical ships. Admiral, you need to see this, Torres called out, pointing to one of the smaller displays. Sarah walked over to see what looked like security footage from inside one of the medical bays. A group of human medics surrounded a small Zephyrian cub, no bigger than a human 6-year-old. The little creature was clearly terrified, pressed against a wall with its scales flattened against its body in fear. Then she watched as Nurse Chen, no relation despite the shared name, slowly knelt down and began to hum a simple tune. The cub's large eyes fixed on her, and gradually its scales began to relax. When the nurse extended a hand, palm up, the cub cautiously reached out with one tiny clawed finger to touch it. They're learning, Sarah murmured. Both sides. Admiral, Harrison called out from across the room. War Prime Thaxtel is requesting permission to come aboard the station's medical bay. He wants to see the evacuated cubs. Sarah considered this. The Zephyrian leader had every right to check on his people, but his presence might complicate the rescue efforts. Then again, the cubs needed to see adult Zephyrians, needed to know they weren't alone with the strange humans. Permission granted, she said, but Commander, make sure he understands that our medical staff is in charge. This isn't about politics anymore. The medical bay on Concordia Prime had been hastily converted to accommodate Zephyrian physiology. The temperature was raised, the lighting adjusted to match their homeworld spectrum, and special feeding equipment had been fabricated using human technology and Zephyrian design principles. Sarah arrived at the medical bay just as War Prime Thaxtel entered with 2 of his aides. The massive Zephyrian stopped just inside the doorway, his large eyes taking in the scene before him. Human medical staff moved quietly between small beds, each one containing a Zephyrian cub. Some of the young ones were sleeping, their scales a healthy golden color now that they were warm and fed. Others watched the humans with curious eyes. No longer afraid but not yet trusting, Dr. Rodriguez approached War Prime Thaxtel, his manner professional but respectful. War Prime, we've evacuated 212 cubs so far, he reported. Ages range from what we think are hatchlings to young adults. Most are suffering from malnutrition and dehydration, but nothing that proper care can't fix. War Prime Thaxtel walked slowly through the medical bay, stopping at each bed. Sarah watched his expression change as he saw his people's young being cared for by their supposed enemies. At one bed, a tiny hatchling reached out with both hands toward him, making soft chirping sounds. The War Prime knelt down, his massive hands incredibly gentle as he picked up the small creature. The hatchling immediately curled against his chest, finally safe with one of his own kind. "They have been alone for so long," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah stepped closer. "Dr. Rodriguez says they're all going to be fine. We have enough medical supplies, and our fabrication units can produce whatever we need for Zephyrian nutrition." War Prime Thaxtel looked at her over the head of the hatchling in his arms. "Why?" he asked, the same question he had posed in the council chamber, but now with different weight behind it. Sarah gestured toward the medical bay, where human nurses taught Zephyrian cubs simple games while they waited for their treatments, where engineers had stayed up all night building toys from spare parts, where Dr. Rodriguez consulted with Zephyrian medical databases to ensure proper care. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. "Because in 18 months of war, we've forgotten that we're all just trying to protect the people we care about. These cubs, they're the future, War Prime. Not just for your people, but for all of us." War Prime Thaxtel remained silent for a long moment, holding the sleeping hatchling. Around them, the quiet sounds of the medical bay continued, human voices mixing with the soft chirps and clicks of Zephyrian young. Finally, he spoke. "You do not fight as we do, Admiral Chen." "No," she agreed. "We don't. Perhaps," he said carefully, "that is not always a weakness." Admiral Sarah Chen hadn't slept in 36 hours, but she couldn't leave the medical bay. Every few minutes, another shuttle arrived with more cubs from the dying generation ship. The human medical team worked without rest, adapting their procedures for each new challenge that Zephyrian physiology presented. Dr. Rodriguez approached her with a tablet full of medical data, his usually neat uniform wrinkled from the long hours. "Admiral, we've got all the critical cases stabilized," he reported. "But we have one problem. There's a hatchling, maybe 6 months old by Zephyrian standards, who won't eat. We've tried everything our medical database suggests, but she just refuses." Sarah followed him to a small bed in the corner of the medical bay. The hatchling was tiny, even by Zephyrian standards, with scales that had lost their healthy shine. Her large eyes were dull with hunger and fear, and when Sarah approached, the little creature pressed herself further into the bedding. "How long has she been refusing food?" Sarah asked. "Since we brought her aboard 12 hours ago," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "In human infants, we'd be looking at forced feeding soon, but we don't know enough about Zephyrian development to risk it." Sarah knelt beside the bed, careful to move slowly. The hatchling watched her with those huge eyes, trembling slightly. Sarah had seen that look before, in human children who had lost everything and didn't understand why the world had become so scary. "Have we tried asking War Prime Thaxtel for advice?" she asked. "He's been helping with the older cubs," Dr. Rodriguez said, "but he mentioned something about feeding rituals, about how hatchlings need specific ceremonies to feel safe eating." Sarah stood up, her mind working through the problem. "Get me everything we have on Zephyrian cultural practices, and find out if any of our cultural attachés speak enough Zephyrian to help with basic communication." The next few hours were a crash course in alien childcare. Sarah sat with Lieutenant Commander Singh, the fleet's cultural specialist, learning about Zephyrian feeding customs. The process was complex, involving specific sounds, movements, and even traditional phrases meant to comfort young ones. "It's not just about the food," Singh explained, reading from her tablet. "For Zephyrians, feeding young is a sacred trust. The adult has to establish themselves as safe and protective before the hatchling will accept nourishment." Sarah looked across the medical bay to where the tiny hatchling still lay curled in her bed, growing weaker with each passing hour. "Teach me," she said simply. Singh looked surprised. "Admiral, this could take hours to learn properly. And even then, you're not Zephyrian." "She might not accept." "Teach me anyway," Sarah interrupted. "That little one doesn't have time for us to find perfect solutions." Learning Zephyrian feeding rituals was harder than Sarah had expected. The sounds were clicks and soft whistles that human vocal cords weren't designed to make. The movements were precise, meant to mimic how Zephyrian parents fed their young in the wild. And the phrases translated into something Sarah could pronounce. Felt clumsy in her mouth, but she practiced anyway, working with Singh until she could make the right sounds, until her movements flowed in the proper sequence. Dr. Rodriguez prepared the specialized formula they had developed for Zephyrian hatchlings, and together they approached the small bed. The hatchling looked even weaker than before, her breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah knelt beside the bed and began the feeding ritual, her voice quiet as she made the traditional sounds meant to signal safety and care. At first, nothing happened. The hatchling watched her with dull eyes, too tired to even show fear. But Sarah continued, following the pattern Singh had taught her, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Slowly, very slowly, the hatchling's head turned toward her. Sarah continued the ritual, extending the feeding implement with the precise movements that meant protection and nourishment in Zephyrian culture. The little creature hesitated, then opened her mouth slightly. Sarah carefully offered a small amount of the formula, continuing the soft sounds that were meant to comfort and reassure. The hatchling took a tiny sip, then another. It was working. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as the hatchling began to eat properly, her dull scales gradually brightening as nourishment reached her system. Around them, the medical bay had grown quiet as human staff and Zephyrian observers watched the careful feeding process. War Prime Thaxtel appeared beside the bed, having arrived so quietly that Sarah hadn't noticed. He watched in silence as she continued the feeding ritual, her pronunciation imperfect but her intent clear. "You have learned our ways," he said softly, his deep voice filled with something that might have been wonder. Sarah didn't look up from the hatchling, afraid to break the fragile trust she had established. "I'm trying to," she replied, continuing the soft sounds that kept the little one calm. "This is HFY Morin," War Prime Thaxtel said, and Sarah could hear other Zephyrians in the medical bay responding to the words with what sounded like approval. To feed another's young when they cannot feed themselves. It is one of our most sacred duties. The hatchling finished eating and curled up in Sarah's hands, finally relaxed enough to sleep properly. Sarah carefully placed her back in the bed, covering her with the warm blankets Dr. Rodriguez had prepared. "What does it mean exactly?" Sarah asked, turning to face War Prime Thaxtel. "HFY Morin." The massive Zephyrian was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "It means guardian of the innocent, one who feeds the future. It is a title of great honor among our people. To act as HFY Morin is to take responsibility for the continuation of life itself." Dr. Rodriguez approached with his tablet, reviewing the latest medical reports. "Admiral, we've got some good news. The last of the cubs are responding well to treatment. We should be able to start transitioning them to regular care within the next day or two." Sarah nodded, but her attention was still on the sleeping hatchling. Around the medical bay, she could see human staff working alongside Zephyrian volunteers who had arrived to help with the evacuation. Children who had been enemies were now working together to care for the most vulnerable. "War Prime," Sarah said. "What happens next?" "I mean, after the cubs are healthy again." War Prime Thaxtel followed her gaze around the medical bay. "That is a good question, Admiral. These young ones are orphans now. In our culture, they would be adopted by other families, but..." He gestured toward the mixed groups of humans and Zephyrians working together. "I have never seen anything like this before." Sarah watched as Nurse Chen taught a young Zephyrian cub how to play a simple human game while waiting for his medical checkup. Nearby, a Zephyrian volunteer helped human children understand the proper way to approach frightened hatchlings. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," she said. "Maybe it's time for all of us to learn new ways of doing things." The medical bay's main doors opened and Commander Harrison entered with a group of council representatives from various species. They had come to observe the rescue operation, probably to report back to their own governments about human capabilities and intentions. But they stopped short when they saw what was happening. Admiral Sarah Chen, the human military leader they had been told was ruthless and unpredictable, sat on the floor surrounded by Zephyrian hatchlings. She was humming a soft tune, something that sounded like a mix of human lullaby and Zephyrian comfort sounds, while the young ones slept peacefully around her. War Prime Thaxtel stood nearby, no longer the rigid military commander but something more like a protective guardian, watching over both the human admiral and his people's young with equal care. One of the council representatives, a tall being from the Crystalline Collective, stepped forward. Its voice came through the translation system with a note of confusion. "We do not understand," it said. "Why do humans expend so much energy on beings that provide no strategic advantage?" Sarah looked up at the assembled representatives, still surrounded by sleeping cubs. Her answer was simple and direct. "Because they're children," she said. "Because they needed help and we were able to give it. Because that's what civilized beings do." The representatives exchanged glances, their various forms of communication creating a soft buzz of confusion in the medical bay. They had come expecting to see military efficiency, strategic thinking, political maneuvering. Instead, they saw something much more complicated and much more human. The council chamber had been reconfigured for the resumed negotiations. Representatives from 7 species took their seats, but the atmosphere felt different now. 3 days had passed since the rescue of Kithera's blessing, and word of the human actions had spread throughout the station. Admiral Sarah Chen took her place in the human delegation section, noting how other representatives watched her differently now, some with curiosity, others with what might have been respect, and a few with obvious suspicion. Saving enemy children was apparently as confusing to some species as it was to others. War Prime Thaxtel entered with his usual dignity, but Sarah noticed subtle changes in his bearing. He nodded slightly to her as he passed, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a week ago. The mediator called the session to order, its voice carrying through the chamber's translation systems. We reconvene to continue peace negotiations between the human colonial fleet and the Zephyrian collective. Before we begin formal discussions, there are several observational reports regarding recent humanitarian activities. Sarah prepared herself for criticism. Fleet Command had already sent 3 messages questioning her decision to commit resources to enemy civilians. Half her own officers thought she was being naive, while the other half worried about the political consequences. The representative from the aquatic Thetans was the first to speak, its words creating ripples in the water-filled communication tube. The Thalen Confederation has observed the human rescue operations with great interest, it announced. Our analysis suggests that human behavioral patterns are more complex than initial assessments indicated. The willingness to expend significant resources on genetically unrelated offspring of a hostile species represents a form of strategic thinking we had not previously documented. Sarah blinked in surprise. That wasn't the criticism she had expected. The Silicon Collective representative activated its speaking platform, the crystalline being glowing softly as it communicated. The collective notes significant inefficiencies in human rescue protocols, it stated, and Sarah felt her heart sink. Here came the criticism. However, these inefficiencies produced outcomes that pure logic optimization would not have achieved. The emotional responses of human personnel appeared to reduce stress in rescued individuals, leading to improved medical outcomes. Sarah leaned back in her chair, confused. Were they complimenting human inefficiency? If I may, interrupted a voice from the back of the chamber. Everyone turned to see a junior aide from the station's communications section, looking nervous at suddenly being the center of attention. The mediator granted permission to speak, and the aide activated a holographic display in the center of the chamber. There's been a technical issue with the council chamber's display systems, the aide explained, his hands shaking slightly as he operated the controls. We've been trying to show tactical reports from the rescue operation, but the wrong feed keeps activating. Sarah felt a cold sensation in her stomach as she realized what was about to happen. The main display flickered to life, showing not tactical data but a live feed from the medical bay, and there, in perfect clarity for all 7 species to see, was Admiral Sarah Chen sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully hand-feeding a tiny Zephyrian hatchling while humming softly. The chamber fell completely silent. On the screen, Sarah could be seen performing the traditional Zephyrian feeding ritual with careful precision. Her pronunciation of the comfort sounds was imperfect but recognizable, and her movements followed the ancient patterns that meant safety and protection in Zephyrian culture. Around her, human and Zephyrian children played together, their species differences forgotten in the universal language of childhood games. Human nurses taught young Zephyrians simple songs, while Zephyrian adults showed human children how to properly greet hatchlings without causing fear. The feed continued for nearly a minute before the aide managed to cut it off, but the damage was done. Every representative in the chamber had seen their human admiral, the supposedly ruthless military commander, treating enemy young with the same care she would show her own species. War Prime Thaxtel rose slowly from his seat, his massive frame commanding attention throughout the chamber. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Sarah had never heard before. The humans speak truly when they say we do not fight as they do, he began, his words translated into multiple languages simultaneously. We believed this was weakness. We believed their emotional responses made them inferior warriors. He paused, looking directly at Sarah before continuing. We were wrong. What we witnessed in the past 3 days is not weakness. It is a strength we did not know existed. Admiral Chen has demonstrated Kethai Moran, the sacred duty of feeding another's young. But more than that, she has shown us what it means to be truly civilized. The chamber remained silent, but Sarah could see the other representatives processing this statement. The concept of strength through compassion was apparently difficult for some species to understand. The crystalline collective representative activated its platform again. Define civilized in this context. The collective requires clarification of terminology. War Prime Thaxtel turned toward the silicon-based being, his scales shifting color slightly as he considered his words. To be civilized is to protect those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of whether they share your genetics, your culture, or your loyalties. It is to recognize that the innocent do not choose to be caught in conflicts they did not start. It is to understand that how we treat our enemies' children reflects who we truly are as beings. Sarah felt something shift in the chamber's atmosphere. The representatives were no longer looking at her with suspicion or curiosity. They were evaluating, reassessing, trying to understand what this meant for their own relationships with humanity. The representative from the Centauri Republic, a species known for their diplomatic neutrality, requested permission to speak. The Republic has maintained careful neutrality throughout this conflict, it announced. However, recent observations suggest that previous assessments of both human and Zephyrian cultures require significant revision. We propose a recess to allow all parties to reconsider their positions. Sarah started to object, worried that a recess would allow opposition to build against the fragile progress they had made. But War Prime Thaxtel spoke first. The Zephyrian collective does not require additional time for consideration, he declared, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Admiral Chen has demonstrated that humans understand concepts we thought they were incapable of grasping. More than that, they have acted on these concepts when action required sacrifice with no guaranteed benefit. He turned to face Sarah directly, his large eyes meeting hers across the chamber. The collective proposes not merely an end to hostilities, but a formal alliance between our species. Any people capable of such compassion toward their enemies young possess qualities that the galaxy needs. We would be honored to stand beside such beings. The chamber erupted in quiet discussions as each delegation huddled to process this unexpected development. Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb what had just happened. The war she had been fighting for 18 months had just ended, not with defeat or victory, but with an offer of alliance. Commander Harrison leaned over to whisper in her ear, "Admiral, this is unprecedented. An alliance offer before formal peace negotiations are even complete." Sarah watched War Prime Thaxtel as he spoke quietly with his own advisors. The massive Zephyrian caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of respect that bridged the gap between their species. "Commander," she said quietly, "I think we just learned something important about the power of doing the right thing, even when it doesn't make strategic sense." The mediator called for order, preparing to address the unexpected alliance proposal. But Sarah's attention was drawn to a smaller display showing the medical bay, where human and Zephyrian children continued to play together while their futures were being decided by adults who were finally beginning to understand each other. The War Council had stilled when they saw a human admiral feeding enemy cubs during ceasefire, but what they had witnessed was something far more powerful than military tactics or diplomatic maneuvering. They had seen the birth of an entirely new kind of peace. 6 months later, Ambassador Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of New Harmony Station, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on humanity's first joint colonial project. The massive station orbited a planet in what used to be the contested Kepler sector, but now served as the headquarters for the Human Zephyrian Alliance. The irony wasn't lost on her. The system they had fought over for 18 months had become the symbol of their cooperation. "The last residential section will be complete next week," reported Commander Harrison, who had stayed on as her chief of staff despite her transfer from military to diplomatic service. "We'll be able to house 5,000 families, mixed human and Zephyrian." Sarah nodded, watching a human construction team work alongside Zephyrian engineers to install the station's final solar collectors. The cooperation that had seemed impossible during the war now looked natural, even inevitable. "And the orphans from Kithara's blessing?" she asked. Harrison smiled, one of the genuine expressions that had become more common since the alliance began. Thriving. Dr. Rodriguez says they're ahead of normal development curves for both species. Apparently being raised bilingual and bicultural has some unexpected advantages. Through the observation deck's main viewport, Sarah could see shuttles arriving from both human and Zephyrian worlds. Each one carried families who had volunteered to be part of this grand experiment in interspecies cooperation. Some carried children who had never seen members of the other species. Others brought adults who still remembered when they had been enemies. The door chimed softly and Cultural Exchange Prime Thaxtel entered the observation deck. The title was new, created specifically for his role in managing the cultural aspects of the alliance. He had adapted to his diplomatic role as naturally as Sarah had, though he still carried himself with the bearing of a warrior. Ambassador Chen, he said, using the formal address they maintained in public settings. In private, they had long since moved to first names. The morning reports show continued positive integration statistics. No major cultural conflicts in the past week. Sarah turned from the viewport to face her counterpart. That's better than I expected, honestly. Two species learning to live together was always going to have challenges. Indeed, Thaxtel agreed, moving to stand beside her at the viewport. Though I believe our success rate remains high because we began with the right foundation. Sarah knew what he meant. The alliance hadn't been built on trade agreements or military necessities. It had been built on the simple recognition that caring for children transcended species boundaries. Speaking of children, Sarah said, how are the integration programs working out? Thaxtel's expression shifted to what Sarah had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a proud parent's smile. Better than our best projections. Human and Zephyrian young adapt to each other's company with remarkable ease. The older generations sometimes struggle with cultural differences, but the children simply accept them as normal. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. Harrison checked his tablet and looked up with interest. Ambassador, we're receiving a delegation request from the Crystalline Collective. They want to discuss establishing a research partnership with the Alliance. Sarah raised an eyebrow. The silicon-based beings had remained strictly neutral during the war, interested only in gathering data and analyzing outcomes. Their request for partnership was unexpected. What kind of research? She asked. Harrison scrolled through the message. They want to study what they're calling compassionate leadership models and emotional decision-making in complex systems. Apparently, our alliance has produced results that their logical frameworks can't fully explain, and they want to understand how. Thaxtel made a sound that was the Zephyrian equivalent of laughter. They want to understand how illogical humans can be so effective at problem-solving. We're not illogical, Sarah protested, though she was smiling. We just use different logic. Indeed, Thaxtel agreed. Logic that includes factors most species ignore. Empathy, compassion, the long-term value of trust. Another chime announced the arrival of the scheduled tour group. Sarah and Thaxtel took their positions to greet the mixed group of human and Zephyrian families who had come to see their new home. The group included some faces Sarah recognized from the rescue operation. Several of the older cubs from Cathera's Blessing, now young adults, had chosen to settle on New Harmony Station. They served as living bridges between the species, equally comfortable with human customs and Zephyrian traditions. One of them approached Sarah with the confident manner of youth who had grown up in an impossible situation and made it work. Ambassador Chen, the young Zephyrian said, speaking perfect English with only the slightest accent. My family wanted me to thank you again for everything you did for us. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of pride and humility that came with such recognition. You don't need to thank me. We did what anyone would have done. The young Zephyrian tilted his head in a gesture that combined human and Zephyrian body language. With respect, Ambassador, that's not true. Many species would have left us to die rather than risk resources on enemy civilians. What you did was extraordinary, even if you don't see it that way. As the tour group moved on, Sarah noticed other delegations arriving for the day's scheduled meetings. Representatives from the aquatic Thetans wanted to discuss joint exploration missions. The Centauri Republic was interested in opening trade routes through Alliance space. Even some of the more isolated species had begun reaching out, curious about this unusual partnership. It's remarkable, isn't it? Thaxtel observed, watching the steady stream of diplomatic shuttles. 6 months ago, most of the galaxy saw humans as unpredictable newcomers and Zephyrians as rigid traditionalists. Now they see us as a model for cooperation. Sarah nodded, then paused as a thought occurred to her. Do you think we would have found this path if not for the Cubs? If the rescue hadn't happened? Taxtel considered the question carefully. Perhaps eventually. But it would have taken much longer, and cost far more in lives and resources. Sometimes the universe provides opportunities to choose a better path. The wisdom lies in recognizing those opportunities when they appear. Commander Harrison approached with another status report. Ambassador, the Education Integration Program is showing remarkable results. Children who started the program speaking only their native languages are now fluent in both human and Zephyrian communication. Some of them are even developing hybrid expressions that neither species used before. Sarah smiled at the mental image of children creating their own interspecies slang. That's how languages evolve, Commander. And apparently, how cultures evolve too. The observation deck's main display activated, showing the current status of New Harmony Station. The statistics were impressive. 0 major conflicts, 97% satisfaction ratings from residents, and a waiting list of families from both species who wanted to join the experiment. But the real measure of success was visible through the viewport. In the station's central park, human and Zephyrian children played together while their parents worked side by side on projects that would have been impossible just months before. The council session that changed everything, Sarah mused, remembering that day in the chamber when a technical malfunction had revealed her feeding the hatchling. Do you think it really was an accident? Taxtel made the Zephyrian sound for thoughtful consideration. Does it matter? What matters is that the right people saw what needed to be seen at the right moment. Whether that was accident or design, the result was the same. A group of young children ran past the observation deck's viewport, their laughter carrying even through the reinforced glass. Some were human, some Zephyrian, and from their easy interaction, it was clear they saw no meaningful difference between themselves and their playmates. That's the real victory, Sarah said, watching the children play. Not the alliance agreements or the trade partnerships or even the military cooperation. It's them, a generation that will grow up seeing cooperation between species as normal instead of impossible. Taxtel nodded, his large eyes following the children's movement. In Zephyrian culture, we have a saying, the future is written in the games children play. If that is true, then the future of this galaxy will be very different from its past. Sarah's communicator chimed with a message from Dr. Rodriguez, now serving as the Alliance's chief medical officer. The message was brief but brought a smile to her face. Good news? Harrison asked. The best kind, Sarah replied. Dr. Rodriguez says the last of the hatchlings from Cathara's blessing has been formally adopted. All 212 of them now have permanent families, some human, some Zephyrian, some mixed. Mixed families? Taxtel asked with interest. Human parents adopting Zephyrian children, Zephyrian parents adopting human children, and some families with both, Sarah explained. Dr. Rodriguez calls it the natural evolution of interspecies cooperation. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had brought them to this point. A war that had seemed inevitable, ended by an act of compassion. Children who had been orphaned by conflict, now serving as bridges between former enemies. A galaxy that was slowly learning that differences didn't have to mean division.